without any limitations in the state of Michigan. Any legislator with their name on these bills or considering voting for them needs to be able to answer these very important questions. Are you concerned about the skyrocketing cost of home purchasing in your community? What's the wisdom in reducing housing supply for Michigan residents who live in our communities year-round and pay taxes year-round during the worst attainable housing crisis our state has seen? What percentage of a neighborhood's housing stock should be short-term rentals? 50%, 75%, 100%? And what provisions in this bill keep a neighborhood from becoming 100% short-term rentals? Lawmakers should be clear on the fact that passing these bills would make our neighborhoods open season for commercial operators looking for a growth market in residential homes turned into hotels. How do these bills protect regular people from having to compete with deep-pocketed commercial buyers from out of town? You'll hear from our speakers today why this is bad policy for Michigan. I also want to make clear that the MML and its members believe short-term rentals have a place in Michigan communities. They shouldn't be banned, and we advise all of our communities to adopt ordinances that permit thoughtful rental strategies. Instead of bills that allow a cancerous growth of short-term rentals, a reasonable compromise should be struck that acknowledges personal property rights of both the long-term resident and the short-term rental owner. And also the difference between residential property used primarily for commercial activity and residents who decide to rent out their property from time to time. At least one alternative bill has been introduced, House Bill 4985, sponsored by Representative DeMoose. We are also encouraged in other compromises still being developed. These alternative approaches need a fair review and consideration before any action is taken. Our message to lawmakers today: slow down, answer these tough questions, and make sure we get this right. I now would like to ask that Mark Washington, the city manager from the city of Grand Rapids, come on and unmute his phone and for a few comments that he'll have from the city of Grand Rapids.
Good morning, and thank you, Dan, for your leadership and that of the Michigan Municipal League. We are very appreciative of light being shed on the concerns from several cities across the state. And I want to thank you again for those of you from the media being part of this conversation today. As you may be aware, the city of Grand Rapids does allow short-term rentals, but we are very intentional about using our current zoning enabling laws to regulate short-term rentals, because we think that it's important to consider other factors like parking and traffic noise and other nuisance that would allow us to protect the health and safety of our community. It's important that short-term rentals be regulated with local control based on how each community in each city and township and village is responsive to its own residents. We do not allow the entire use of homes as part of short-term rentals, because that was the preference of our local constituency when developing the zoning laws. So local zoning decisions are created with the abundance of community input that allows us to do what's best for our community and residents and neighbors to hear their voice and opinions and maintain the kind of quality of life that they want to have when living in Grand Rapids. So unfortunately, the House bills that were being considered, House Bill 4722 and the Senate Bill 446, does not consider local voice and local preferences, and the decisions are being made with an across-the-board approach that's not good for each local community. And we want to be able to have our own residents and businesses determine their own needs when it comes to short-term rental. These bills ignore the reality of how short-term rentals operate, and many of them are not home sharing like the preferences is in our community, but it is actually renting the entire home for extra income for a few short periods of time while the homeowners are away. Short-term rentals operate as commercial enterprises, and it basically takes over the character of a neighborhood. And not only have we seen that attempt in Grand Rapids, but also in other cities that I've had the privilege of working for, and my most recent city that I came from in Austin, Texas, where we had tremendous amount of nuisance complaints and neighborhood complaints about noise and traffic that was destroying the character and vibrancy of the neighborhood because of irresponsible owners. So again, the current bills that are being promoted strip away our ability to address these kind of complaints and zoning laws. I did check with, in visiting with staff, even our own co-compliance, we have seen upticks in some of our community in terms of the type of complaints that are derived from short-term rentals. It's not unreasonable to expect that people have the ability to acquire additional income by the use of their property, and we think we have responsibly done that by enabling it to occur, but within the context of our zoning regulations, to ensure that our quality of life for all of our residents will be protected. We urge all lawmakers to reject any legislation that ignores the work local communities have done to set fair and local regulations to uplift their local needs. What works in GR may not work in other communities across the state, and what works in other communities may not work in in Grand Rapids. So that's why we think that there should be local control around this issue instead of a far broad-reaching statewide short-term rental law that does not recognize the unique needs of every community. So with that, Dan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Mark. It's important not just to have your experience in Grand Rapids, but coming from a city like Austin, Texas, that has experienced this previously, and seeing some of the problems they've got there, and some of the things we need to be able to avoid here in Michigan. One other item. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I apologize. There's one more point I forgot to make.
Go for it.
Yeah, and I neglected to say that, and I apologize. But our greatest need in this community right now is not for short-term rentals. Our greatest need, as you alluded to earlier, is housing. And we've quantified our housing shortfall. And we need over 9,000 housing units over the next 4 years. And so we have plenty of hotels, and as I mentioned earlier, we have places where people can experience short-term rentals if they don't want to stay in hotels. But in order for us to maintain the kind of quality of life we need in Grand Rapids, we need additional housing supply. And I don't want this legislation unintendedly to create a further gap, a further erosion of our housing supply when those owners of property that would have short-term rentals would basically be utilizing that property. For the most part, it would be people who would be outside of our community that would be taking advantage of what would be eroding our housing supply. So I just wanted to add.
Yeah, that's a great point. Again, this one size fits all means that none of that stuff can be taken into consideration at the state level, like it would be around the tables locally, where residents have a voice in what's going on in their particular neighborhoods. And again, we think that's why this single approach that's so permissive makes no sense for anybody here in the state of Michigan. So thanks, Mark. And we may have questions for you later, but now I'd like to call on Bridget Smith, the city manager from the city of Frankenmuth, who's going to talk to us about what's going on in that particular community. Bridget, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning. I'm the city manager for the city of Frankenmuth. And while everyone knows Frankenmuth is famous for chicken and Christmas, what makes Frankenmuth special is its residents. Many people don't realize that while each year our town literally welcomes millions of guests, we are a community of about 5,000 people. We work very hard to keep our neighborhoods strong. That's why for our city, regulations regarding the location and intensity of short-term rentals is important. I like to think of zoning like a recipe, and every place has its own recipe. That's what makes communities different. For Frankenmuth in the 1980s, our recipe included dozens and dozens of bed and breakfasts. As things changed over time, our recipe changed too. Now we have a mix of short-term rentals, traditional hotels, a hotel with a water park that has a retractable roof, and still a handful of bed and breakfasts. We most recently amended our ordinance in 2019, and we partnered with our short-term rental property owners, hotels, and our residents to develop an ordinance that worked for everybody. I think this is really how regulation is supposed to work. It protects personal property rights and still respects neighboring properties. As we've discussed these pending bills at our City Council and Planning Commission, what's most disheartening is that the short-term rental bills on the floor ignore all this careful, collaborative work that we've done. It ignores what we have put a priority on locally. And to be honest, the people I work for don't want their neighbors to change every 3 days. In another community with a different zoning recipe, it might be right to have a different approach. I think there are some reasonable ways and alternatives available to legislators to ensure that communities can't outright ban short-term rentals, but still give that discretion to a local community to allow them to figure out what their right mix is. One recipe for the entire state would taste horrible.
To bring it back to the chicken and recipe thing there at the end. I like how you did that. Thank you very much, Bridget. Before I call on Derek Lemansky, who's an owner of one of these properties, to talk about how good ordinances and good public policy are working right now, I want to say this about somewhat of a scare tactic coming out from the other side, and that is that cities and townships and villages across the state are outright banning short-term rentals. We have 533 cities and villages, municipalities here in the state of Michigan. We have not found a single community that has done that. There are over 1,200 townships, and we have one instance of a community that has actually gone out there and tried to ban them outright. And I can tell you that neither the Michigan Municipal League or the Michigan Township Association is advocating to its members and educating them that they should be banning these outright. Instead, we're telling folks and we're educating them, and our message is very clear that we need to have thoughtful local ordinances that take into consideration all of the unique aspects of a particular community, and that's what we're talking about here today. So on that, I would like to turn it over to Derek Lemansky, also from the fine community of Frankenmuth, see what kind of chicken recipes he can weave into his public comments, and better be good. No pressure, Derek.
Bridget's a lot better cook than I am. Let's get that out there right now. So I'll avoid the recipes. We'll let her stay with that. Thanks for having me on, Dan. My wife and I, we operate a short-term rental property in Frankenmuth, Violet's Place in Frankenmuth. And as someone, we both followed the rules and worked with the city from the beginning to do things the right way. Before we even bought our property with the idea of doing this, we reached out to the city. Is this something we can do, et cetera. So I'm also asking lawmakers not to erase the short-term rental laws in our community. And I think it's important to note we live here. You know, we don't just rent here. We actually own our home here as well. So we live in this community. We comply with all the local tax collection requirements. We've ensured that our guests know the local rules in place for noise. We've kept our properties up to a T. And by doing these things, we feel like we're protecting the historic nature of our community. For the legislature to then erase our local laws, that would invite owners to buy up properties in individual neighborhoods for this reason or for this purpose. And it would undo the balance we have created between our residents and our tourists. So any law adopted on a statewide basis for short-term rentals should protect that balance and not skew in favor of either side. I'd ask that lawmakers vote this down and seek alternatives that achieve that compromise.
Thank you, Derek. We appreciate your remarks, and I think they're spot on. You know, as I said earlier, there's 533 cities and villages in the state and over 1,200 townships. So we at the League represent for our largest communities like Detroit and Grand Rapids, where Mark is from, down to small communities and to communities like Frankenmuth that has a thriving visitor business. Now we'd like to go north of the bridge and go all the way up to Marquette. And again, we're talking about how this will impact individual communities if we have this one-size-fits-all approach, because the communities on this phone are very, very diverse in terms of what's going on in their communities, the housing markets in their communities, the rental properties in their communities. And that's why we've got to be able to preserve some of this conversation and preserve the the ability to make some of these decisions locally. Jen Hill is the Mayor Pro Tem of the City of Marquette. And I'd like to turn the floor over to Jen here to give a couple comments about why this is important up to communities like Marquette and communities up in the UP. So Jen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you, the MML, and thank you to the other communities who are sharing the floor today about these concerns. The City of Marquette actually started working on short-term rental policy in January 2017. We took months at the Planning Commission and City Commission level to develop a policy that makes sense for our community. I'm here today because housing is our #1 issue today in Marquette. I'm seeing posts on our community pages of folks who have gotten jobs here in Marquette, are coming here to go to school, and they are not able to find housing. And I personally, just last week, received for the first time a letter offering to buy my house for cash, no appraisal, no one seeing the house, and buying it as is. And to do all of this, and as quickly as 24 hours. We need to slow down and think about how to balance housing, tourism, and community. It's a beautiful day here in the UP. It's in the mid-60s. It's a sunny day. We absolutely welcome our tourists and love to share the best part of Michigan with all of you. And yet, we do need to take the time to think about what works for our community so that we can have that balance. Our ordinance has been praised for its block by block approach that protects neighborhoods and year-round residents while welcoming visitors to experience these neighborhoods as an option in addition to our traditional lodging options. And then after having that policy for a year, we went back and revisited that policy in 2018. And we in fact expanded it so that owners of a property that had multiple units in it, a duplex or a triplex, could in fact rent all of those as short-term rentals and not just one. So again, we've taken a thoughtful approach. And then in 2020, we actually instituted an ad hoc housing committee in order to think about the multiple housing crisis situations that we're in right now, where we don't, like Grand Rapids, we need more permanent housing. And they met through COVID. We continued to get input over Zoom. So we have had years worth of thoughtful conversation about housing issues in Marquette. That report's just being released this month. So we have taken our time and thought about these issues carefully for a period of years here in Marquette. And we're not the only community in the UP that has short-term rental policies. Other communities do as well. We're all taking a thoughtful approach, and we encourage the legislature to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, panelists. And now we can open it up to questions here. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat box, or you can simply unmute yourself and just identify who you are and where you're from and ask a question to anyone on our panel. Before I open that up, I'd just like to reiterate that our goal here is to implore the legislature not to adopt a one-size-fits-all approach to housing here in Michigan. It doesn't make sense for rental housing. It doesn't make sense because you can't possibly know all the issues going on from one end of the community to the next. We don't want the state government to override the interests of local residents with a big government approach coming down from on high in Lansing. These are issues that need to be taken into consideration at the local level. So with that, I would open it up for questions. Again, you can put something in the chat. Matt Bach is here. He's going to help me whisk through all the information on the chat here. And Matt, feels free to punch through with a question if you've got it.
Yes, we do, Dan. Hopefully you can hear me okay. A question from the center square is a reporter there. If housing shortages are so bad in these cities, why not make it easier for developers to build more houses?
I think we've got 3 folks on the phone here that would love to see developers build more houses in their communities, and are doing everything possible to make it available for people to build a good quality, affordable housing in their communities. So I'll probably ask one of the local officials to speak to that question, because I know it's something you guys deal with every day. I don't think it's I don't think this bill has anything to do with making housing more affordable for folks, but go ahead.
Dan, I'll start. Of course, we want to see the housing supply increase. I alluded to that earlier in my comments, and we use a variety of housing tools to incentivize that, from low income tax credits to tax incentive financing for developers to brownfields. And we want to see housing done. We've revitalized our zoning to incentivize more small scale development. We've looked at what we can do within the city to increase density bonuses, particularly downtown. We want to double our downtown residency. We have about 5,000 people staying downtown. We want to double that to about 10,000. We've looked at public-private partnerships. We're creating a local housing fund. Part of that, we're trying to use some of our ARPA funds to do that, to incentivize how can we create affordability at all levels for permanent housing, as well as looking what we can do for supportive housing for homelessness. And so we are looking to partner with anyone who wants to develop permanent housing here in the city of Grand Rapids. We even changed our local zoning ordinance around retail storefronts and on the first floor, ground floor level here in the downtown area, to make sure that you don't have to just have commercial retail on the first floor now, that we're going to allow residential in our city center. So we've done a lot to incentivize more housing development.
And I think you'll see that echoed across the state. And I would just say this, there is no country anywhere in the world that I know of that is utilizing an Airbnb style approach to making housing more affordable for people in their community. It's not any way, shape, or form an approach that would be good on a community-wide basis to provide for more housing when you're going to have out-of-town owners and commissions coming off the top for people renting those and advertisement and everything else. That's just an apples and oranges situation, and it will not help us here with affordable housing in Michigan. Matt, what's our next one?
Yeah, so the next question is from Dave Bondi at WEYI-TV, who Dave did an excellent article last week on this topic. So his question is, so in essence, if this passes, and I'm assuming we're talking about 4722 or SB 446, could every home in a neighborhood be turned into a short-term rental if these two pieces of legislation as currently are passed?
Yes.
Dan's short word answer is yes, that is true. The next question.
And then I got another one-word answer. Mike Malott has asked, actually, are we aware of any municipalities in Michigan that have banned short-term rentals? The answer to that is no. So.
Yeah, municipalities. And Dan, you said at the start, there might be one township.
We know one township out there, but none of the municipalities have. And again, we don't see that prevalent. That's not something we're asking folks to do or we think is the right situation. I think the locals on this phone think that's the wrong approach too, and they're working with their communities to make sure it's moving in that direction.
Another question here is your preference for HB 4985, which is the new one that came out last week, or for the legislature to do nothing? What's been the effect on court decisions on some of these ordinances so far? That might be a question for our legislative advocate, Jennifer Rigtrinker, is also on the call.
Yeah, we've got Jennifer Rigtrinker on here, who's been our lead staff person on it. Obviously, I'll answer it this way. We think this is a solution looking for a question. We do not have communities banning these outright, as we talked about. There are good rental property programs going on in communities right now. So in some ways, the legislature doesn't need to act, but we certainly think some of the compromise bills, whether it's what was introduced this past week or whether it's issues that are still being worked on right now, are a much better way to move forward than 4722 or 4466. Jen, you may have specifics you want to add to on that, or you may not. Please unmute yourself if you do and let us know your points.
I don't know if Jen is over there.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm having some technical issues. Okay, Matt, can you repeat the question for me, please?
Sure. I gotta scroll back up to it. The question was, is your preference for HB 4985 or for the legislature to do nothing? That's the first part of the question.
Our preference is absolutely not, is to find a compromise. We are trying to deal with this issue. We've been talking about it, fighting about it, trying to compromise on it for about 4 years now. And I believe that local government, in responding to some of the issues we've heard from the other side about locals prohibiting or banning it, you've already heard from the league and Dan, as well as our communities that are on today. No one thinks we should be banning short-term rentals, so let's clarify that in the law. Section 207 of the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act already talks about not being able to prohibit legitimate land uses. So we believe the Zoning Enabling Act already covers this, but let's clarify it. And then let's give the opportunity for everybody to do it, but also allow locals to be able to regulate and protect the integrity of their neighborhoods when they need to. Many municipalities aren't even regulating short-term rentals. So we absolutely want to find a compromise on this. We're not just trying to kill the issue at hand. The current bills, yes, we would like those to not move forward, and let's work on something that works for both sides.
Okay, Jen, we got a couple more questions probably for you, but our panelists can jump in as well. Lindsay Moore from MLive, who also wrote a recent article on this topic. She said both the House and Senate added substitutes to HB 4722 and SB 4446 to narrow the bills to only stopping the cities from banning short-term rentals, not touching zoning regulations. Can you explain on why that was not seen as a solution, or what concerns remain?
So the subs, the S1 and H1 that passed out of the respective committees before these bills went to the floor, absolutely are still banning locals being able to regulate through zoning. It states that a short-term rental that they're defining as any lease less than 30 consecutive days cannot be held to any procedure different than the other dwellings in a residential neighborhood. You can't use a special use, a conditional use, and you cannot differentiate between a residential property where someone lives and resides and a residential property that's been bought for an investment purpose to run a vacation rental business, which is a commercial activity in a residential neighborhood. And so those substitutes absolutely do not allow locals to regulate. And saying that the only thing locals can do is look to their nuisance ordinances, the whole point of zoning is to prevent nuisances from happening, is to buffer land uses that could possibly create an issue on a neighboring property. And so to allow communities to only deal with issues after the fact is laughable. I mean, locals are using zoning to prevent nuisances. And so saying that we're going to let nuisances happen and then we'll let people issue a noise violation, well, there's somebody new in that property every few days. So that doesn't actually stop the nuisance from happening.
Thank
so
you, Jen.
I would disagree with that statement that the subs did anything to allow locals to regulate.
So it sounds like maybe the reporter maybe was given some misleading information a little bit on that point as far as what the substitutes do. Related to that, Jen, there's another question that's kind of along the same lines, but I think it's important. It says, proponents of the current bills argue that the bills won't take away local control, but instead just prohibit local units from banning short-term rentals. What is the response to that premise, and is that fair assessment? And again, it's the same kind of.
That is not a fair assessment. That's a false narrative, and those sponsors need to be pressed if they don't know what their actual bills do that they have introduced and put their names on.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something on that point, Dan?
No, I think Jen did it. It's a false narrative, period, plain and simple. And
another question here is, do you think if it passes without compromises, lodging industries will have to more closely compete, perhaps by dropping rates or other incentives? That might be a good question for Bridget or Derek.
So at least from the city of Frankenmuth perspective, we have a couple of hotel owners who actually also operate a short-term rental. So I think short-term rentals offer an opportunity to guests for a different kind of experience. But I don't see them as really wholesale displacing the type of service you get when you go to a hotel. And I'll also add that in Frankenmuth, those hoteliers were also sitting around the table with us when we crafted the ordinance. And it was actually at their suggestion that we increased our number of permits because they thought offering short-term rentals was a great way to maintain the face of our community. So many of these rentals are on the city's Main Street. And so having them become short-term rentals meant they had better upkeep, better appearance, they were decorated for the holidays, and all of that the hoteliers and the Convention and Visitors Bureau thought was beneficial.
Okay, thank you. Well,
Matt,
one other, go
I
ahead,
would just,
Jen.
I would just add to that the Michigan Lodging and Restaurant Association, or excuse me, the Michigan Restaurant and Lodging Association is public in opposing these bills. And anyone that would like further information should reach out to Justin Winslow for their statement from the lodging industry.
All right, Dan, we had another question, and that is, do you think the short-term rentals pose any security risks? That might be for one of our community leaders. I know there are some.
Let me jump in first on that, Matt,
Sure.
because I think this is something, and absolutely I'll have to hear from a community leader when we're done, but I think this is something that's been under considered by the legislature. It hasn't been talked about in the media much, but you know, again, the proponents of this bill say, okay, you've got a 3-bedroom home and your kids are grown and moved, and maybe you want to rent out your back room and make a couple extra bucks, and that's sort of the vision of the world. But when we talk about commercializing these places and people coming into communities and buying up large swaths of homes, you can be moving people back and forth as long as they're under 29 days. We don't know who's in there. We don't know what they're doing, and we have no capacity to, in any way, shape, or form, based upon the way these bills were originally written, to regulate these places. So whether it's a home next to a school, who's in there? We have all kinds of laws in terms of who can be where and when they can be there. But this legislation would basically wipe all that stuff clean. So we don't know who would be in. We'd have no way of tracking it. We'd not be able to regulate it in any particular way. And absolutely, there are some security risks in this. Again, not from the guy trying to rent out his back room necessarily, but from people coming in on a commercial basis and looking to move people around in a commercial way, which is always going to be sort of an aggregate way that we're looking at doing this. So we have grave concerns about that from security purposes. But I would ask any of our local officials to speak to how that might look in their community.
Yeah, I'm glad to speak up. I know our fire chief and our fire department is in charge of inspecting the rentals, and this is an added burden, adding this on, and there are concerns about what is happening in those properties and having that turnover happen and having staff to have to manage that is another concern. And it's my understanding that the Fire Chiefs Association, in fact, has come out also in opposition to these bills. So that is a concern. And I can say here in Marquette, we're tracking the information, and only 6% of our short-term rentals are homestays. The majority of them are renting out the entire home, the entire unit, I should say. So it is not certainly support it being one way for folks to be able to start maybe their journey on housing, but that's not what we're seeing here. We're seeing that the entire building is being commercialized.
Thank you. I'm also posting in the link, one of the questions, are there other states that have taken or are looking at taking a blanket approach like this legislation proposes? And Jen, you might be able to jump in. I know we have done some research. I was just getting ready to post in the chat a link to our short-term rental resource page, which is shorttermrental.mml.org. And in there are some research studies that have been done that we've shared, including out of the state of Arizona, where they did open the floodgates. And then very shortly thereafter, they regretted it. And there was a study that talked about the impact that had, and it was pretty significant. So that research is listed on our website that I'm posting in the chat now. Jen, did you have anything?
I think Arizona is a great example.